Hello. So, welcome to this latest episode of my podcast, Creating a Buzz About Health. And today I really wanted to talk about the latest research that came out last week, which was about just how many tons of pesticide are used in the UK in the towns and cities. And this is particularly of interest because it does impact bees. And this podcast is creating a buzz about health. And so it's really important for me to share with you just how this impacts our own health as well as that of bees. So, first of all, here are the facts: 354 tons of pesticides were sprayed in the UK's towns and cities. Now, I've been following the use of glyphosate for many, many years, and I know that there's been freedom of information requests sent to councils over the years, and this is the first time that the results have been released. And what I have found interesting is in the past, when freedom of information requests have been sent, they have been denied or not fully shared because of the balance of use of employers' time. So the reason for not answering these questions about just how much pesticide is used in towns and cities was denied because it wasn't the most cost-effective use of their employees' time, which I get. However, if we're paying the wages of these people, and if we voted in these people in our councils and in our governments, and we want to know where our money, which is coming from our tax, is being spent. And there have been studies which have also found, or research that has found, that 65% of the British public no longer want pesticides used in their public spaces. We don't want them used in our playgrounds or on our cemeteries or on the roadsides. We actually want to have more pesticide-free areas. So this is really, really important. So to give us a bit of context, I wanted to give you an idea of the cost of this. Now, this study is only based on the councils that actually agreed to share their information, and it only represents 10% of the use of pesticides in the UK. So, I mean, this is a minuscule amount, and yet 354 tonnes is the equivalent to 23 double-decker buses. So 23 double-decker buses of pesticide are used in our towns and cities and public spaces. Now, the current rate, if you were to buy 5 litres of glyphosate or Roundup, which contains these pesticides, so it's the most commonly used herbicide, 5 litres is between £30 and £60 for a 5 litre tonne. So if we went for £60, because most people go for the branded ones, that makes 360,000 litres, which is 72,000 5 litre containers at £60. So we're talking about £4,320,000 spent on pesticides in our towns and cities, only 10% of the use. Now, why am I worried about this? Well, first of all, I'll talk about why is it even used in the first place? So these pesticides, which contain glyphosate, which is an organophosphorus compound, they're used to kill weeds. And the idea is that the way that they break down certain amino acids and compounds in the weeds is that it prevents them from growing, so it kills them. So that's why they spray it on the weeds, and then in a couple of days you see the weeds all yellow and brown and they're dead. However, it was always believed that the microorganisms in the soil break down these organophosphorus compounds, meaning that it was harmless and safe, and therefore nothing to be worried about. And the fact that you'd have to spray again the next year or in a few months' time was sort of confirming this. However, a few years ago, there were some cases in courts in America where people that were working as the applicators, they were spraying these compounds, with developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so the manufacturers have actually paid out billions of dollars in compensation for people who've been able to prove through the legal system that they have developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from their job, which was spraying these herbicides. So we know that it has some kind of impact on humans, even though we're not meant to contain or be made up of the same components that these herbicides are meant to be attacking. So then we have to look at, if we know it's affecting humans, we know it's killing plants, how does this impact bees? Now, the bees and the insects, they are the front line of our environment. They really are sort of showing us what is happening in our environment. And if we're in that same environment, my argument always is that what's killing the bees is also killing us. And if you're as old as me and you're in your mid-50s, you'll remember a childhood where there were a lot more insects around. There were, more birds, more insects, more spiders. Everything was around. The world was more alive than it is now, and possibly less cancers and less illness. Anyway, that's a different subject. But how does spraying these weed killers to kill the weeds on the edge of road strips or in our parks and cities, how does that impact bees? Several ways. Okay, the first one and the most obvious thing is that our bees are all starving. Honeybees need flowers to collect the nectar from to feed themselves. And it's from that nectar that they then make honey. Even the solitary bees and the bumblebees, they still need nectar and pollen from plants to feed their own larvae, to expand their colonies and to grow. And we can all be agreed that we need pollinators. We need the bees and we need the beetles and we need all the other insects, the bumblebees, the honeybees, all of them to pollinate our food. And so if they don't have enough food, they starve. And we know that bees are starving. Many, many beekeepers, I would say a really high proportion, unfortunately, are driven to feed their bees sugar syrup, sugar fondant and sugar syrup, because there is not enough forage to feed their bees and take a honey harvest. So we know that bees are starving. This is the number one problem. And when you combine that with the fact that we know we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows across the UK in the last 70 years, then it's no surprise that the bees are starving. So if you're going to kill all the wildflowers, and the wildflowers are considered weeds and therefore, public enemy number one, and the general reason for spraying these chemicals in the first place, then we're starving the bees. So we do need to look at, why do we need to kill dandelions? Why do we need to kill weeds or wildflowers that are appearing, on our curbsides and dotted around? And it is an interesting question, and it is a challenge, because even I admit that it can look really scruffy when we have plants growing up through curbsides, and it can become dangerous because it will lift up the concrete, the paving slabs. So we do need to have a way of managing it. But we also need to look back. If you listen to my episode with Peter Yeo, where he shares his insight that we need to look at plants as being the skin of the planet. So if you have all this, these scars, which are our tarmac and our roads and buildings, if you have them covering up the land and exposing the skin or creating a scar, then the earth needs to heal. So it is going to put plants in these scars to actually heal. So we do need to look at our plants, and there are some areas that we need to manage plants, but do we need to be spraying chemicals? This is the question. Now, if we had more of our wildflower meadows, if we had flowering hedgerows, then our bees wouldn't be starving and they wouldn't be so impacted when we do spray, or when the weeds are removed along our curbsides and in our public spaces. So that's the first way that bees are affected by all this massive use of pesticides, is the fact that they're starving. So the next thing is, there have been a lot of studies on bees that have been exposed to pesticides. And first of all, I'm going to talk about bumblebees. Now, bumblebees tend to live in the ground. They live in our lawns, and there'll be small colonies of between 50 and 100 bees, maybe 200 bees with some of the larger bumblebees. And that whole colony will be died out by the autumn. And what happens is only the fertilized queens live through the winter months. And so you have this colony that is growing, but it's really important that the colony can maintain its temperature. And what they've found is that when bumblebees are exposed to pesticides, and in particular herbicides and glyphosate, is that they are unable, they have a 25% reduction in ability to maintain the temperature of their hive or their colony. And if their colony is not the right temperature, then the larvae die, the eggs don't form. And so the bees do not expand. Now, Professor Dave Goulson has been studying bumblebees and solitary bees for many, many years. And I remember learning from him, gosh, 15 years ago, that when you had colonies of bumblebees pre-agricultural pesticides, a colony of bumblebees would produce 33 queens a year. So that's how many queens they would produce so that they could sustain their population. They then found that doing in a controlled environment with bumblebees, so a controlled environment where bumblebees were not being exposed to pesticides or herbicides, they then would produce 3 queens each season, and that would be to sustain themselves. So we can already see that's a dramatic reduction from 33. Well, then, because Professor Dave Goulson knows where wild bumblebee colonies are and has been studying them for his entire career, he was then researching in the field, how the bees really are impacted by the use of pesticides. And he found that they were only producing on average 1 queen per season. So this is dramatic. And this really shows the difference in the health and well-being of bees just from being exposed to pesticides. Now, one of the arguments I've always shared, which to me is quite obvious, is that if we're using these pesticides to grow our food, and the way we're growing our food is killing the insects that pollinate it or are living where we're growing our food, what does that say about the impact on us when we eat that food? So for me, it was an absolute no-brainer to stop eating non-organic food, because if these chemicals are killing the insects that are living in their environment, then what on earth is it doing to us? So that was, a no-brainer for me. But I know for a lot of people, that's a big step. And we have been educated in a way that separates us from the way our food is grown and the relationships. And if you trust what all the labels say, that these chemicals are bee friendly, bee safe, whatever, then you would assume that they've been tested on the food that we're going to eat and therefore they're human safe. But they don't have to test them on the food we eat. So it's down to independent organisations who test our food, like Pan UK, who then can show how many residues of pesticides and fungicides and herbicides are actually found in the food that we eat. But what I'm trying to talk about today is just the immense use of pesticides in our urban areas in the UK. So what does it do to honeybees? So when honeybees are exposed to Roundup or glyphosate, it actually has several impacts. So not only are they starving because we've killed all the wildflowers that they eat, but it also affects their behaviour and their health and their immune system. And with a weakened immune system, a colony of bees is more vulnerable to things like veromite or things like other diseases and pests. They're unable to protect themselves. And trying to find out how that does really impact them is really, there's just been so much research. And it can affect them in so many different ways. So the fact that these chemicals were devised supposedly only attacking the weeds, the plants, the flowering plants, some of which are highly medicinal, it just shows that no, it does affect insects and it does affect us as humans. So is there any good news with this? Well, when I was looking into the article, so it's you can read it all on Pan UK, and I will actually share the link so that you can read this article. They have actually got some good news. So London, of all places, is actually doing better than most towns and cities. And 23 out of London's 33 councils are actually ending or have ended pesticide use. So London is moving towards being a pesticide-free city, which is really good news. Now, Paris has been a pesticide-free city for a number of years, so wouldn't it be great if London could follow that way? And in public places, It's quite interesting because we do have 47% of councils are no longer using pesticides on their playing fields. 34% are no longer using these pesticides in their cemeteries. And I recently visited my cousin's grave in a cemetery near Stroud, and I was really pleased to see all the wildflowers that were growing there. And it was just beautiful. It really was beautiful to see all these wildflowers growing amongst the graves. And there was mowed areas, but there was also great clumps of cornflowers and thistles. And it was beautiful because you could sit there and you could hear all the insects buzzing. So we know that the moment you let the wildflowers bloom, the insects will come. And of course they'll come because they're blimmin' starving, they're hungry. So I really wanted to share this because when I saw this number of all this pesticides that's being used, I think it's quite easy for us to go through life and ignore it and think it's nothing to do with us, doesn't impact us, doesn't affect us. But if we're killing the bees, then we are impacting our life. We're not only impacting the ability to have pollinators for our food, but we need to look at how it's killing the insects. And we know that residues of glyphosate have been found in breast milk, in children's cereals, in our blood, in our urine. So it's getting into our systems. And so there must be residues on the plants that are used to create our food. And this is why going chemical free is just essential for our own health and well-being. So if you want to do one thing, one simple thing to help save the bees, if you claim that you love the bees, you want to save the bees, the number one thing you can do is eat chemical-free food. The more of us who stop buying into and funding chemical agriculture, the cheaper and the more affordable organic food and chemical-free food will become. So it really, really is essential. And the more healthy you will become because you're not going to be putting these heavy toxins into your body, increasing your risk of cancers and in particular non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And don't we all want to be healthier and living happier lives? So we can look to the bees. The bees are the canary in the coal mine. And if the bees are dying, then we really need to look at who is going to be next. So thank you very much for listening. And until next time on Creating a Buzz About Health, bye for now.